Hey, everybody. Good morning. Last day. Last day, last talk, even, weirdly enough.
Last day, last talk.
Yep. We are the ones standing in between you getting out of here.
We promise to be interesting. Todd will tap dance at the end if you stay that long.
That's right. It will not. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the KEV, which stands for the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities List. And it's pronounced KEV. We're going to go real quick over how the KEV was founded and formed. We're going to talk a lot about the criteria of what does and doesn't get on the KEV, which we'll probably be illuminating. I have a bunch of post-it notes for examples of things that like made it or didn't make it onto the KEV, and then finally we'll wrap up with a little bit of the future of what we want to do with the KEV. Altogether, like we put these slides together and we can present these in 5 minutes or an hour, so it does definitely accordion to taste.
Yeah, and we do realize after doing this presentation several times that a couple of common questions come up throughout, so we've tried to answer them. If you have other questions, save them for the end. Even if we run out of time, Todd and I will be around to answer your questions.
Yeah, we're trying to build in several minutes at the end for questions. So,
all right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so my name is Lindsey Cerkovnik. I'm the chief of the Vulnerability Response and Coordination Branch here at CISA. Todd is the brains behind the KEV right now, but I am going to have the most boring part of the presentation, but also the most foundationally important part. There's like one thing I really want you to understand after going over the history of the KEV. And when I talk about it, I'm going to like wave at you and make sure that you understand that. So to talk about the KEV a little bit, we have to talk about something that we do at CISA called the Stakeholder Specific Vulnerability Categorization, or SSVC, scoring process. Has anybody here heard of SSVC? Can you raise your hand?
Cool. Oh, loads.
Yay, good job. All right. So at CISA, if you've done, let me back up a little bit. If you've done vulnerability management at an organization of almost any size, you understand that it is impossible to apply 100% of your vulnerability response resources to every single vulnerability in the world. It was impossible 10 years ago. It's impossible today. And that's because the number of vulnerabilities out there is immense. It grows our ability to identify them grows every year. And frankly, not all of them are that important to you as a person doing vulnerability management for an organization. So at CISA, we use a process called Stakeholder Specific Vulnerability Categorization, or SSVC, which I will forever now in this presentation say SSVC instead of the long form because it is very long. And we do this, this process is basically a decision tree. You can call it something fancy, but it's a decision tree based on decision points that are evidence-based. And so when we're going through the process of scoring every single vulnerability and determining this is what I'm interested in, leading the team, determining what percentage of our response resources to apply to which vulnerabilities, SSVC is really helpful. And it has some particularly important decision points, one of which is state of exploitation. Yep. And so this is like a foundational piece of how the KEV came about. So when we're scoring SSVC, we have this particular decision point for state of exploitation. You could have no exploitation that we know about. You could have, some indicators of impending exploitation, like publicly known proof of concept code, and you might even have active exploitation indicators. You might know or have some intel that tells you that something's being actively exploited. So CISA has been doing SSVC for years, right? And so over that period of time, we've accumulated, as you can guess, a really large list of internal, a large internal list of vulnerabilities that we know to be exploited. That brings me to our next slide, which I will go to. There we go. So we had this great large list of known exploited vulnerabilities internal to CISA, and then in November of 2021, CISA issued the Binding Operational Directive, or BOD 2201, which sounds really doom and gloomy, but it requires federal agencies to take CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities list, or KEV list, and to remediate vulnerabilities included on the list within a CISA-defined period of time or time frame. The BOD language recommends that every organization use the KEV, but it compels and requires federal agencies to use the KEV and to comply by the timelines that are listed. This is the important thing that I want you to understand as we talk about the rest of the criteria for the KEV. Because of this binding operational directive, and because the KEV is inextricably tied to the binding operational directive, we have some really specific criteria that we use when we consider whether or not and how and when to add a vulnerability to the KEV. One of those very sort of step zero things that we do is we have to make that determination about whether a vulnerability, whether it's being exploited or not, actually has impact on the federal civilian executive branch agencies and networks. And so we have this little joke on our team where we say, we don't care about your internet connected toothbrush. And actually one of our KEV leads is a former dentist. And she says,
She definitely does care.
Yeah, she's like, I care about your toothbrush. But for the purposes of the KEV, we don't care about internet connected toothbrushes. We really care about those vulnerabilities that have the largest impact on the federal enterprise. With that, Todd, can you please recite from memory the 3 criteria that we use?
Oh, I can. Here, I won't even look at the slides. The 3 criteria that you must have if you're a vulnerability and you want to be on the KEV, you must have a CVE. I personify a lot of the vulnerabilities and exploits, but you have to have a CVE ID. There must be reliable evidence of active exploitation somewhere in the world, and there has to be some kind of clear remediation for this bug. These are like the 3 pillars of how vulnerabilities get on the KEV. And then the rest of this presentation is going to be breaking down those 3 pillars. It sounds super easy, and everyone I'm sure feels like they get it right now. But there's some weird little twists and turns, which is what makes this presentation fun.
Yeah, we've learned some lessons. We're going to share them with you.
Yep.
All right, criteria number 1, seemingly the most straightforward. A vulnerability that we're going to add to the KEV has to have a common vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVE ID. Who knows what a CVE ID is? Everybody knows what a CVE ID is.
Friday. You've probably heard about them.
It's Friday. Yeah, you've probably heard about them. All right. So I've got some CVE program history on here that I'm not going to go into because I think a lot of you already know about the CVE program and probably understand how it works. But essentially, a CVE ID is a unique way to identify a vulnerability. Previously in CVE lore and history, CVEs were assigned by MITRE alone. Now the program is federated and they are assigned by a collection of vetted CVE numbering authorities, or CNAs, almost 400 of them, of which MITRE is one and CISA is one, and some of your organizations probably also are one. And so this federation has led to an exponential growth in CVE IDs. It's allowed us to assign CVEs to vulnerabilities a little bit more efficiently and to respond to them more quickly. As I said, you might think that this is straightforward. A CVE ID is in some ways a prerequisite for vulnerability response in the federal government, certainly, and across many of your organizations as well. However, we do encounter situations, fairly often where exploitation is discovered and the CVE ID is not yet assigned. In that case, have no fear.
Yeah.
No CVE ID, no problem. CISA is a CVE numbering authority. We are a CNA, and our scope used to just include industrial control systems devices and medical devices. More recently, in the last year, we've added to our scope vulnerabilities that impact the federal civilian executive branch enterprise and do not fall in another CNA's scope. This has been extremely helpful in addressing active exploitation scenarios in which a CVE ID is not assigned for whatever reason, in many cases because the responsible vendor is not yet a CNA and they need a little bit of help. Todd,
yes.
Can you give an example?
I certainly can.
Great.
So once upon a time, there was a vulnerability in Screen Connect, ConnectWise Screen Connect. It was getting actively exploited on the internet. Everyone was talking about it, and mysteriously, there was not a CVE ID yet. There was even a patch available, and there was like an update path and everything. We were all ready to go to get this thing on the KEV, but no CVE. So what ended up happening was we asked around the CNA community, said, "Hey, has anyone got this? Does anyone have this? No, no. Okay, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it right now." And then we issued a CVE ID for that. Within 3 minutes of MITRE also issuing a CVE ID for it. So we got on the phone with them. We ended up using ours, CVE 2024-1709, if you want to go look it up, is that one. That one was a weird case for a couple different reasons, why it's really easy to remember. Also, I have Post-it notes over there. But what ended up happening was we resolved the conflict. They retired, MITRE retired theirs, we had ours. And ConnectWise is not a CNA themselves, which is the main reason why they didn't have one yet. And so we ended up having it, and then later that day we added it to the KEV, and all was great in the world, and then everybody could go and fix it.
Yep, much speedier, much more efficient
Yeah.
than waiting and figuring out who was
Yeah.
going to assign the CVE ID.
And that whole process took about a day, I want
Yeah,
to say.
about a
beginning.
day. And we run into these kind of often. We get exploitation scenarios when CVE IDs don't exist. This is the process we go through. We've got it down to about a day, which I think is pretty fantastic. All right, on to criteria number 2, Todd.
Active exploitation. This is the one that gets you. So active exploitation may seem like it is very straightforward. It is not, turns out. So you can read mostly here. I'll talk a little bit over this, but basically what counts, and what counts is reliable evidence. Like we need to be able to see and rely on the evidence that this thing is actually getting exploited out in the world. And it has to get exploited by a threat actor without permission of the system owner. This has come up. So like sometimes people will be running pen tests and say like, hey, it's exploited, put it on the KEV. And we're like, no, that doesn't count. Attempted exploitation can count. It depends. This is where things get a little bit fishy and weird, and we have to fudge around. Successful exploitation obviously definitely does count. Merely the existence of an exploit, like as a noun, does not count. Exploit as a verb, yes. Exploit as a noun, no. Like I said, penetration testing doesn't count. Mere scanning, this comes up actually quite a bit, and just inventorying targets out on the internet, this also does not count for us. And most honeypot activity, generally speaking, doesn't count for the KEV. All of this is like super useful, and this is very restrictive. This is more restrictive than I think you'll find across industry. And the reason for this is that, like Lindsey said, is the binding operational directive.
Yeah, anytime we want to tell you the reason we do something is because of the bot, I'm going to wave like I did the first time when I told you that was a very important point.
Yep. So binding operational directive 2201 says federal networks must act on this, which means they have to do their scanning. They have to usually interrupt whatever change control flow they normally have. It's an emergency event that pops up for federal networks. There's what, like 22 or something agencies?
Yeah, it's funny. It may surprise you to learn that when you compel the entire federal civilian executive branch enterprise of the U.S. government to do something,
inside
you really need to be pretty darn sure. Yeah, inside of a short period of time, you really need to make sure.
Every one of these bugs is $1 million bug, like at minimum, right? It costs to do all this. So this is why we're very restrictive and selective of what goes on the KEV and what doesn't. You want to hit the next slide? So, yeah, next slide.
Did it go?
No, it did not.
There we go.
There we go. So what counts? We weigh our sources. Things like proof from the victim counts a lot. If the victim comes to us and says, hey, we got owned, and here's the PCAPs, and here's the logs, and check it out. And here's like the post-exploitation activity that shows that it actually did work and it happened. That's great. Researcher proof will depend on usually a call with the researcher, and that's a call that I make. I've talked to several people in this room over the last year about this, but we'll walk through with researchers of well, how did you figure it out? Especially if you're not on the victim network. We will talk to vendors and who basically have no reason to lie to us. So if Microsoft says something is exploited in the wild, we will tend to believe them unless it's real fishy, and then we'll reach out. We have good relationships with lots of vendors out in the world, Microsoft, Apple, Oracle, everybody, and they're but a phone call away. And by phone call, of course, I mean Teams chat, because we're the government, we use Teams. You're welcome. And so yeah, so we will look at all of this, all of these kinds of evidence. If you hit the next slide, I believe the next slide is things that don't count. No, it does not. But I will tell you what doesn't count. So things that don't count, some rando on Twitter saying, hey, this is exploited. News reports are great tips, but generally don't cut it. The news will tend to conflate things like scanning activity with exploitation activity. And we have run into this as an example. One of the recent ones, there was a Jenkins bug, and it's not on the KEV, so I don't have it memorized. I'm going to go look. It is CVE 2024 23897. You will not find this on the KEV, but you will find this Jenkins bug being reported as exploited. It was not exploited as far as KEV is concerned. It is essentially, this was a what was it called? It was like args4j or some dopey name like that. And you could do like a local file read on the Jenkins server. And all of the evidence we saw was the proof of concept code getting run all over the internet. And all the proof of concept did was scrape like the first 3 or 4 lines of etc password. If you've ever looked at the first 3 or 4 lines of etc password, you know this is kind of boring. Like good stuff happens way later in etc password. Also, etc password doesn't actually have passwords, and so all in all, this was scanning activity. Everything it was reported a lot at the time as exploited. I am still waiting for real exploits to happen on this thing. If you have been exploited by CVE 2024 23897, please let me know.
Maybe we should put the CVEs in the slides. I
No,
haven't
I
thought
don't
about
wanna
that one.
No, I don't.
We'll keep it fresh.
Right. Yeah, we're gonna keep it fresh, and I don't want to like put vendors on blast or anything in our slides. Just with my mouth. So yeah, so that's the kind of thing that we will get a lot of feedback on, very constructive feedback saying, hey, how come this isn't on the KEV? And then we will patiently explain, well, it's not actually exploitation as far as we're concerned. I am super happy for industry to call that scanning activity and exercising the vulnerability as exploited. You should do that, right? And it's a great warning sign that something bad is probably going to happen
It
soon.
helps us keep eyes on the vulnerability for the future, but for the purposes of the KEV and the binding operational directive,
Right.
the pod.
And that's the thing. It's like when we get reports like this of scanning activity, especially very reliable reports of scanning activity, we can tell people about it. We just won't do it with the KEV because, like we said, getting on the KEV is extremely expensive and requires a lot of action. But we can warn people about it. We have like weekly interagency calls. It'll come up there. It'll come up through MS-ISACs. Or just ISACs, I guess, but usually MS-ISAC. We will partner with other governments and let them know. It's like, hey, we're seeing this. You might be seeing it too. By the way, have you seen any real exploitation? And so that's kind of how that goes, right? So we're not bound to silence just because it doesn't hit this exploitation threshold, but we won't put it on the KEV. So back to how these all work, right? One thing we want to make absolutely clear is that we're very threat actor agnostic when it comes to the KEV, and also we're very target agnostic when it comes to the KEV. The act of exploitation, a lot of people believe that the KEV only covers things that were exploited inside the federal government in those 22, 23 agencies. Not true. Any exploitation in state, local, tribal, territorial in the United States, any exploitation against other government networks,
Critical infrastructure,
any exploitation in critical infrastructure, which there is a lot of. It's hard not to be critical infrastructure these days. Anything along those lines. All it has to do is pose a significant threat to the federal enterprise, which are words from
binding operational directive.
So that is our floor, not so much like where the exploitation is targeted towards or from. And I think that's all I'm going to say on that because we got to move.
All right. Criteria number 3, effective mitigations. This one, again, seems really straightforward. And everybody is going to take a picture of the slide because this is a straightforward slide. Actually, not straightforward. If there's something you learn from the slideshow, it's that none of these 3 criteria are actually that straightforward. But our binding operational directive indicates that we must have a clear remediation action for the vulnerabilities, such as a vendor provided update. Of course, we love to have a patch, right? We love to put a patch on the KEV. That's pretty straightforward. But not all vulnerabilities are patched at the time of exploitation. Not all vulnerabilities will ever get a patch. And sometimes we need to fix something or address it in the KEV prior to a patch being released. And sometimes there are effective mitigations that are non-patches that we are able to use and recommend in order to add something to the KEV. And in a worst case scenario, we can recommend that an agency remove something from their network entirely, rip that appliance out of there, get it out. Who's done that and knows how easy that is? It's not super easy. So we don't love to recommend that, but it is an option that we have. Can you tell us, Todd, an exception to one of our mitigations? And in what case would we not necessarily a specific example, but under what circumstances would we not recommend someone turn the thing off?
So turning the thing off, if that leads to massive property damage, life and limb dangers, if people are going to die because you turn this thing off, we will not recommend that you turn it off. And so in those cases, in the case where there is a CVE, it is active exploitation, we're very sure about it, but there is no fix from the vendor because for whatever reason, and the thing is like controlling a dam and you turn it off and the dam opens and you flood a town. That won't get on the KEV, and that's a bummer. But
and the other thing that you'll see, and we've had people ask questions about this before, is something that underwent exploitation and then was added to the KEV 6 months later, 6 months or more later. In many cases, that's because one of the three criteria were not met in the beginning. Mitigation is probably the most common.
I'd say it's the most common.
It's the most common, and maybe 6 months later we found a mitigation. And we're able to add it, or an effective workaround. Sometimes there's a configuration change or something that you can do manually in order to eliminate the possibility of exploitation.
And once again, like even if there is no effective mitigation, if there is some kind of like complicated thing that you can do to like, kind of mitigate it, we can tell people about that. It just won't be on the KEV. That's going to be the biggest distinction. So just like with the exploitation, versus scanning, mitigation versus like sparkling mitigation, I guess.
Sparkling mitigation, mitigation on ice.
Right. Like those are the cases where we would reach out, especially to like critical infrastructure. We'd say, hey, we know that you have this problem. Here's what we think you should do about it. You tell us. Again, critical infrastructure though is not beholden to the BOD, to BOD 2201. They merely should patch these things.
We recommend it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go over quickly because we are doing really well on time and I want to have some question time.
Yeah.
I want to go over quickly. We do run into edge cases. So the complexity of mitigation is a huge spectrum, which you all recognize and understand, I'm sure. It could be something very simple. It could be something extremely complex. And we run into these edge cases every now and then. And I think we even have an example we can talk about in Black Lotus. But some things that are difficult to add, but not impossible. And they sort of break our normal process, but require us to do a little bit of extra analysis and adjudication. These are things like hardware components, third-party libraries, chipset vulnerabilities, protocol level vulnerabilities. That's really tricky. These edge cases do pop up every now and then, and we recognize that they represent a risk, and we need to adjudicate on a one-off basis for a lot of these types of edge cases. So Todd, could you give us an example of an edge case like that?
Yeah. So I've got a couple off the top of my head. There was the DHCP option 102 vulnerability, I want to say. Not if you know what I'm talking about. Okay. That is on the KEV. I don't recall what the CVE ID is for that. It is a CVE ID. There are hundreds of DHCP implementations. And so the thing that we point to as the effective mitigation is patch it or don't use it. And so that's kind of the end of that, right? But that takes a lot of work to like figure out, it's like, well, is it really reasonable to do this? Is this actually an effective mitigation? Something like that. That was a case where we did land on adding that to the KEV. Something that's not on the KEV yet is an old CVE. I'm going to look at my notes. CVE 2022-21894. It is the Black Lotus UFI exposure in Microsoft. As you can guess from the CVE ID of 2022, this has been around for a couple of years now. There is still no really good mitigation for this. There's a lot of complicated things you can do in your network to kind of work around it, make sure that you might not be as exposed to this kind of thing. But until Microsoft delivers on, I believe, their last leg of a patch in Windows, which will be October of 2024.
Yeah,
Hope. That's when that is released, that's when that will almost certainly get on the KEV. But you don't have to wait for it to be on the KEV. You can work around it now. And we actually have like a whole white paper. If you just search like CISA Black Lotus, you'll find our white paper on like ways you can mitigate against it. But it's not like a straightforward patch. So that is the main reason why it's not on the KEV. So things that aren't good for the KEV at all, they may smell like things that should be on the KEV, but they're not. Just a lack of secure design in general, that will not make the KEV. If you have a component that the only way to connect to it is over Telnet and it must be exposed to the internet, that is a bummer of a component, but it is not going to get on the KEV. There's no like identifiable vulnerability with that. It is just bad security. But you can fix this with secure by design pledges and such. And so if you haven't taken a look, just Google for secure by design CISA, you will almost certainly land on like the newly released secure by design pledge that was announced at RSA, I believe, a month ago, 2 months ago, something like that. A mere inappropriate exposure of things like you have a firewall control panel that is also exposed to the internet side. A bad idea. But we do have another BOD, my second favorite BOD.
Different BOD. I'm going to raise this hand for that BOD.
Second favorite BOD is BOD 2302, mitigating the risk of internet exposed management interfaces. Check it out. This is a different binding operational directive. If we happen to find it, we advise that you take measures to firewall that off, right? And then finally, intentionally vulnerable applications. You may recall the lulls that we all had when someone assigned a CVE to the damn vulnerable web app, which the entire purpose was to be vulnerable. Those things will not get on the KEV either, mainly because they do not pose a significant risk to the federal enterprise. But yeah, that's pretty much all the things that you won't find on the KEV. We have had a couple backdoor. We've had one backdoor, I think, maybe 2 added to the KEV. That's new for us. We'll see how it goes. So things that we're looking to expand the KEV with. First off, I very much want to tag KEV with CWEs when we know them. And turns out we're in the business of assigning CWEs to CVEs through our vulnerrichment project. And so most of the time, I would say most vendors that have bugs that end up on the KEV are already providing CWEs anyway. So we should just say what they are on the KEV. I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. But boy, changing a government website is hard.
Imminently, I promise, imminently.
Yeah. I mean, we've signed off on everything. We're ready to go. I kind of want to tag things like by the kind of target it is. Is it a desktop? Is it a mobile app? Is it a server? Is it network infrastructure? Something along those lines. Not super sure how we'll do this yet, but like I think that would be useful for defenders to at least get a sense of, especially for like academics, right? Like get a sense of like of the 1,000 and change.
I should have worn my shirt.
This is my KEV shirt. We made these shirts when we had over 1,000. We have 1,100 or so now, and now we have like a pretty decent size of data, right? That we can start categorizing and tagging in all kinds of ways for research reasons, right? Like, well, I want to know like how many of these are like network gear and how many of these are operating systems, right? We want to be able to publish on the KEV directly some decision points. We are publishing these right now through the vulnerrichment project of the technical impact and whether or not these things are automatable. If it's on the KEV, it is exploited, so it hits that SSVC thing. But we score all these things anyway. We already have all the data. It's just a matter of publishing it. And we have started to do that through ADP. That's a whole another thing. But anyway,
that's another talk.
It's a whole nother talk. And then finally, I want to get better at explaining KEV. Like, this is great. This is super fun. Thank you so much for showing up. But this doesn't scale very well. We need to have better, faster, stronger documentation around the KEV, why it is the way it is, why it's okay that we constantly lose races with researcher organizations for identifying exploited vulnerabilities. But yeah, that's mainly what I really want to do with my time.
So I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Is that right? We have about 5 minutes. Awesome.
Rad.
I'm so proud of us,
Yes,
Tod.
run. And if you have any questions and we don't get to them today, you can email us. I read that. Humans read kev@cisa.dhs.gov. Email me your questions and especially
human.
email me your tips.
This human, not any human,
Yeah,
this human.
this human in particular, me and like a bunch of other humans, but I do too.
Okay,
Anyway.
we have questions over
Hey.
there.
Yeah, hi, great presentation. So I was wondering a few things. So first, how does KEV relate to existing scoring systems like CVSS? Do you plan, will KEV replace it, or is there consistency? What do you think of?
I think
that?
CVSS and SSVC do two different things, and they can happily coexist. SSVC is very stakeholder specific. We publish our scores now through the CVE ADP program and Vulnenrichment. But I think that CVSS is still very useful, especially the string, right? Like nothing in SSVC says like local versus network, right? But CVSS does.
Just a quick question. Do you have any numbers in terms of how many vulnerabilities are on KEV? How many you get how many you publish every month, for instance?
Sure. So we have about 1,180, I think, today in that neighborhood. And we publish, I would say in a typical week, we'd publish maybe 1 to 4. So pretty low, mainly because we're very strict on exploitation and figuring out mitigation.
Thanks. Next question.
Hello,
Hi.
Andre Bauer from Commerzbank Zert. Thank you for the talk. My question is, how to handle something like Log4j?
How do we handle Log4j? Well, so that is a case where the mitigation is not particularly clear because you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things on there. I don't know if Log4j is actually on the KEV.
I think one of them is.
I think one of the early ones is where it was a pretty straightforward fix. But yeah, for something like
One
that.
of our edge cases that's I think is listed as software or hardware components takes it requires kind of one-off adjudication. Like it doesn't, in other words, it doesn't go as smoothly onto the KEV as some of the other vulnerabilities. It requires us to do some analysis and to talk to our executives and say, here's the risk we're accepting by adding this to the KEV, and here's the risk we're accepting by not adding it to the KEV.
Right.
And ultimately, that decision is a risk decision.
Have you seen any traction on the regulatory agencies in the US to actually enforce KEV to their critical infrastructure sector companies that they are regulating so that they should need action? And the second question is, have you seen any international collaboration in the area of KEV? Other countries using KEV or actually publishing their own lists?
Sure. I'll take the regulatory question first and then pass it to you for the international collaboration.
Perfect.
For the regulatory question, I think CISA always kind of has to say it when we're on stage talking about regulatory issues. We are not a regulator. We do not regulate. That's just my thing that I got to get out of the way. I do think that I have heard conversations about how to effectively use the KEV for critical infrastructure owners and operators. The reality is that in the United States, that is such a diverse population that it is not quite as easy as it might be to enforce compliance across the federal civilian executive branch enterprise. I do think the language in the BOD is very intentionally suggestive that critical infrastructure owners and operators and all organizations should use the KEV for the purposes of prioritization. But right now, CISA is not a regulator. That's not something that we can enforce.
Yep.
And to the
And
international.
As far as cooperating with our international friends, yes. I know that other governments on Earth basically crib from our homework, and that's fine. You should. Like we've already done a bunch of the work, and it's silly for you to like redo it. As long as you believe us, then you are more than welcome to, steal our homework and use the KEV for your own constituencies. I've seen, the newsletter out of Australia, right? Like the hot chips newsletter from the Australia, what are they, ASD now?
ACSC.
ACSC. They often cite the KEV as like, this went on the American KEV, and so now we're going to scan around for it. So like that's
And
one
we do
example.
have international partners, both official governments, also certs and other kind of private organizations internationally who will give us input for the KEV. Will give us tips and things like
We are very reliant
Yes.
on public-private partnerships and public-public partnerships for populating the KEV.
Okay, final question.
All right. Great presentation. Looking forward to the tap dancing.
Yeah.
One question I have is, so things only go onto the KEV, but they never go off the KEV, right?
They rarely go off the KEV.
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot of discussion, I know, in like the EPSS SIG regarding vulnerabilities that seem to fall out of favor and where you see declining exploitation activity.
Mhm.
Have you ever thought about like adding a tag for something like that,
I would
or
love to.
removing
Yeah.
things entirely?
So basically the question is, does
Sure.
age matter?
I'll take one part of that. The
Yeah.
tagging, we have more optionality in tagging than we do in removal because
Right.
of the way that we build the KEV. We create a requirement based on a time frame. And so for us, the requirement never goes away. I'm sure an organization may have mitigated it, but that requirement to have mitigated by that date never goes away. So for us, it's a bit of a historical record. We have removed 1 or 2 CVEs from the KEV, I believe, in the
That's
past.
2 removals that covered, I think, 5 CVEs
Sure.
total.
But I do like, hello, fellow EPSS SIGger. I do like the concept of optionality in tagging. That's something that I think we are thinking a lot about. So I
Yep.
appreciate that.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for now because the break already started.
Ah.
But please thank the speakers. I'm sure they'll be around to
Yeah.
answer questions.
Email me. Thank you.